Popeye's Scary Good new Freddy Fazbear Box has garlic palm tenders and cheesy bites with marinara sauce. Try it before it's too late. And see Five Nights at Freddy's 2, only in theaters. Love that chicken from Popeyes. Limited time at participating U.S. restaurants.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I am joined by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa. Justin, welcome back to The Politics Guys.
Hey, Trey, it's good to be here.
It is great. It is that time of year where we get festive, and if you're thinking we're talking about the holidays, no, we're talking about the end of the semester.
That's right. I'm wearing blue, not green today, but that's my my end of semester
Well,
or
that's
something.
fair. But the politics, guys, we don't have a break quite the same way. It's a little bit different. And also, if you're a listener, you want to be here. You're not like our students who, we don't always even see them. They like, you have the student who shows up and you're like, who are you? And they're like, well, I'm in your general education class. I just haven't come for the last 15 weeks.
Oh, I'm giving in-person finals in a couple weeks, and I'm excited to meet all of these people for the second time. Yeah.
They're theoretically on the roll. Who knows? But we got to have a little levity because we are leading off with a story that the guys weren't able to prep quickly enough last week. So we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to begin with the tragedy in D.C. And so by this point, I am sure that most listeners have seen this. 2 members of the West Virginia National Guard, Specialist Sarah Beckstorm and Staff Sergeant Andrew Wolf, were ambushed in Washington, D.C. near the White House. Now, Specialist Beckstorm was killed. Sergeant Wolf is still fighting for his life in the hospital in D.C. These attacks occurred on November 26. But again, we're going to cover them today because there just wasn't time to prep last week. On one level, this story is just kind of the immediacy of violence, right? An ambush attack just blocks from the White House. On another level, there's kind of a complex web of policy problems and politics interacting with one another in the wake of the the incident. Now, the suspect, Ramula Lakawanlo, I think I'm saying that correctly, Justin. For those of you watching, you can see his eyebrows go up like I'm glad he did that first, is a 29-year-old Afghan national. Now, here's what's kind of defining and I think likely to be episodic. We're going to get into communication here in a minute, but I'll pause on that for a minute. He wasn't a recent border crosser. He was a former ally who worked with CIA-backed units in Afghanistan. He was granted asylum as part of Operation Allies Welcome, but crucially, that asylum was approved during the Trump administration in April of this year, 2025. Now, in a political environment completely defined by immediate reaction, President Trump's response has been swift. He immediately invited the grieving families to the White House, but then also controversially announced a halt on all asylum decisions and a pause on visas from anyone holding an Afghan passport. The rhetoric from the Trump and his inner circle is pretty clear. And it's this: Biden-era policies are broken, and this extends to the vetting process. As a matter of fact, this past week on cable news, the administration, when asked why they granted the asylum claims, argued that it was based on the previous administration's broken process. That was on a number of channels, including Fox News. Now, Trump is at the intersection of 2 policies. 1, the use of military for domestic policing, and 2, immigration restrictions. Now, these 2 have obviously come together powerfully. The asylum halt isn't about the shooter. It is a purposeful signal that an immigration crackdown needs to happen, and there has to be a differentiation from what the Biden administration was doing. This week on Thursday, in light of that, the United States Citizen and Immigration Services said that the asylum seekers will now only be valid for 18 months instead of 5 years. This comes after, again, the Trump administration brought all asylum decisions to a halt and ended immigration applications from what it calls high-risk countries. Also this week on Thursday, it created a $550 fee for work permits for asylum seekers. That was an application that was formerly free. As USCIS Director Joseph Edlow said, quote, after the attack on National Guard service members in our nation's capital by an alien who was admitted into this country by the previous administration, it's even more clear that USCIS must conduct more frequent vetting of aliens, end quote. Now, I want to add a little bit of political communication from the literature, Justin, then I'm going to let you run with this. I think a lot of people aren't really familiar with some of the most important media effects. And for any of my students who are listening, that is on the exam. But it's true.
Mine too, I bet.
No, but as you well know, one of the most important media effects that we study is framing. And there's a variety of different kinds of frames. But one, so for example, kind of the basic frame is an equivalency frame, but another really important frame is episodic versus thematic. And what this kind of moment does is it creates an episodic frame. What that means is that we start to look and understand the events in terms of one particular case example, as opposed to the totality or the thematic frame of what might be going on with asylum seekers or any particular topic. And why I bring that up is episodic frames tend to be the more emotional ones and therefore the ones that we tend to use the most, right? The reason we follow people around in stories as a personality is we connect with that in a way that we don't connect. And it seems to me that what we've seen in the last 2 weeks has been that these issues of immigration, of the use of the National Guard, have now shifted into this episodic frame as a result of this violence. And so we've kind of had this trigger for additional emotion. And so, Justin, I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about what, I mean, obviously the killings are horrendous.
Yeah, and that was kind of before we started. What am I going to say about this except that's bad? Like, don't kill people.
I think the larger question becomes, how does this affect American policy as it relates to immigration? And I think kind of reported is how might this have an impact on the continued use of the National Guard? As a matter of fact, Oklahoma, our governor just sent National Guard members to D.C. after saying he wasn't going to do it because of the attack. So thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, I like your episodic versus thematic framing. I would actually, I was thinking of it in a slightly different way. So yeah, it's absolutely episodic, but I think, Trump is trying to turn it into a theme, that this is something bigger. And so if you look, as we go back, he's highlighted a lot of individual episodes of, crimes committed by immigrants, asylum seekers, et cetera. There's actually a murder in Iowa a couple of years ago that got national prominence because of that. And a young woman was killed by I think he was a farm worker who was, here illegally. But I think there is, I think you're absolutely right that there is this episodic thing, and that's that emotional component. You can put a name to a face in a way that, statistics don't, et cetera. But I do think that the administration has been trying very hard to build a case that these are part of a theme. This is, and I mean, that's, and we see this with the way that he talks about Somali immigrants, pivoting from there's this kind of Minnesota corruption scandal that, they're all thieves and garbage and, things like that. And to my mind, this seems like more of that, and I think, in terms of shaping policy, to my mind, this is an opportunity just to do what he wanted to do anyway, which is crack down. I mean, that has been, from the beginning, his goal is to crack down on immigration, and not just the illegal kind. I mean, he focused on that in a lot of his rhetoric, but it's pretty consistent here. I don't want people getting asylum. I don't want, I want to make it harder to get citizenship, because there is, excuse me?
Harder to work, as a matter of fact. It's going to be, even for asylum seekers, it's going to decrease the number of people who can theoretically even have asylum.
Because there is this nice out where you can say, and I know a lot of people, who are more restrictive on immigration than I certainly am, who, you can make it this out that, well, it's not about race. It's about, it's about following the process. Oh, but by the way, we're going to change the process, is that. And to my mind, I mean, this just feels a little bit like any policy that comes out of this. It's more that this is a justification of what they wanted to do anyway than that this is we're going to
Do you think, though, that this – I don't disagree from the point of view of the Trump administration. But
Sure.
I do think that this
In terms of-
event, I think these kinds of frames, I do think that they're going to make those positions more popular than they might have otherwise
Now that I
been.
think is absolutely fair. You know,
Okay.
to the extent that you
it
need.
seems likely that it seems like, so for example, the conversation about the National Guard is going to take on a different frame now. It's going to take on a different aspect, a different polling.
And these are really hard to argue against, you know. So, I mean, I kind of, before we started, as what can I say except this is bad? But anything that you do makes it look like you're callous. Kind of when you have a face like that, and my partner and I kind of argued about this with the Iowa thing when it happened. And my take was, well, that was bad, but I don't see why it impacts immigration. And the response is, well, why do you hate this dead girl? Sort of is
Don't you want to protect people?
Don't you want to protect people? And I think this kind of where I was thinking of this and thinking of a number of things lately is this idea of kind of collective responsibility, and whom we apply that to. I think one of my concerns with this, as the way it's presented, is that for various minority groups, we don't treat them politically as individuals. And sometimes individuals do bad things. And there was, in fact, I'm not even going to quite go with it, but I think it was Ilan Omar had a quote that got sort of mangled, but about, well, some people did some bad things. And, her point was, don't attribute all of that to everybody. But, and I think this is one of those scenarios where, again, just to be clear, like, this is bad. Like, don't shoot people, like, that's not okay. But to then extrapolate this out, I don't think this is a failing of immigration policy. I think at the end of the day, sometimes people do, as individuals, do bad things. And, we are, and again, this is a very bad thing, just to be clear, but we can't get perfection out of a policy. Like, I don't know what vetting there is. I mean, there was some indication from people in this guy's immediate life that he was kind of going through it, was having some difficulties, which we often do see in people that commit acts of violence, is that there is
Absolutely.
some sort of
Well,
trigger. But we
then in
don't.
I mean, I think one of the things, when you talk about the immigration policy here, I'm not trying to completely disagree with you, but I would like to add a little bit of context in the sense, like let's think about the Afghan particular policy. We are exiting Afghan, and we're trying to decide Afghanistan. We're going to be exiting, and here's a bunch of people who, from many people's point of view in Afghanistan, are collaborators with the United States.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the right thing to do is to let them. There was a whole debate about this a couple of years ago, as whether
yes,
and you can't just abandon people that were allies to be eaten up by the mob.
Well, but the conversation about it has become about almost the generic immigration policy, and in some ways, this seems like you need to even be more specific and thoughtful about this, because this isn't about generic immigration policy. We're talking about a situation that we created in Afghanistan, individuals who have helped us, and then the argument seems to be, well, they should have waited in Afghanistan longer. And the answer is they would be dead,
right,
or likely tortured, or, I mean, best case scenario, maybe nobody kills them and just burns their house down. I don't know. But
and to take this further in a let's blame America and get Justin fired from his job, kind of direction. But this guy was basically a young soldier, like a more or less a child soldier. One could make the argument that some of his mental health struggles come from that. I mean, we had talked.
Well, and that's what
we had talked about kind of this debate earlier, as like
even
translators and things like that. But so not only is this guy kind of a pariah back in Afghanistan, but beyond that, I mean, the problems that he has seems to be, possibly stemming from involvement on our side of the
Think how many
conflict.
members of the military come home profoundly changed because of their experiences.
In fact, two recent crimes. I mean, the guy, two veterans, the guy that set fire to and shot up that church in Michigan was one. And then there was that strange, what was it, North Carolina, South Carolina, the guy that shot up a restaurant from a boat.
I don't remember that. I'm going to be honest with you, Justin.
It was the strangest thing. He came out on a boat at a kind of riverside restaurant and shot a bunch of people. Both of those kind of U.S. combat veterans. And so, I mean, kind of the couple things, and I saw a couple of people bring those up as examples of this. I mean, one, seeing combat and seeing certain things is probably it's has some serious mental health consequences that we often don't deal with. But two, nobody said, deport all the white guys, after these incidents or, any number of other incidents, so kind of back to what I was saying about collective responsibility, those guys get to have mental health problems that probably explain it, or maybe they're just a bad apple or something like that. Whereas, in this other case, clearly this is a failing of, this is clearly
all Afghans,
and we've got to have a policy to fix that. And I don't even know what policy that would be. I mean, there's all this talk of like more vetting and blah, blah, blah. But, I don't know that, again, without having been in his file, but I'd be very surprised if there's anything there that, it sounds like he kind of had a break, fairly recently, which people do. It happens.
And again, that makes it horrible and terrible. But as you're rightfully pointing out, it doesn't mean that there's a fundamental flaw with our Afghanistan allies, our Afghani allies. And it also
or the vetting process. I mean, you're just not going
Exactly.
to catch every, I think that's something that is to an extent held up as sort of this standard that Trump is presenting, that there is some way that we could like perfectly vet who is good and who is not. And
I'll be honest, and then we'll have to move.
We got to
our
move
next
on.
story.
Yeah,
I think a lot of that, Justin, isn't really about I mean, I've looked at this carefully here on from my Republican friends. I think the answer really is that the right amount of immigration is zero immigration.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right.
And I disagree.
Which goes back to what I said earlier about, I think this was just an excuse on some, know.
So, but I think that will continue to become a more popular, that is a relatively, in the same way that I think my particular positions on immigration are unpopular because they're too open from the average citizen.
And I think we're pretty close.
Yeah, but I think that the zero historically has been also not liked by the average. But I think these kinds of incidents have made that a more viable position.
I think
more. I don't want to say that it's like mainstream, but I think that kind of hinting at that zero is the goal. Becomes viable.
And certainly that seems to be within the administration. I mean, there are certainly people in Trump's orbit that's their position as well. But I think you're right. I mean, this is a powerful, it's a powerful image and something that's really hard to argue against, even if that's, not a sensible policy.
Well, let's turn to the Caribbean and Venezuela boats and the rules of engagement, shall we, Justin? And talk about
more collective responsibility and
So we're going to turn to the strikes on potential drug boats or narco ships and signal leaks that may become defining features of the defense or the war. I don't mean that as a tease. I'm not always really sure what the real language we ought to be using there. But we'll call it Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth for now. Early in September, reports surfaced of a United States military strike on a vessel in the Caribbean Sea. The boat was suspected of trafficking narcotics. Now, attacking the boat was part of a new policy fighting narcotics terrorism. Now, the controversy here from this week isn't about the narcotics. It is about the rules of engagement and attacking potential shipwreck survivors. Now, according to some recent reporting, after an initial strike disabled a vessel, surveillance spotted survivors clinging to the wreckage. Now, the standard law of armed conflict, including the United States military's own standing rules of engagement, state that incapacitated survivors are no longer targets. They're to be detained or rescued. Shipwrecks are actually specifically called out by law as being those incapacitated. So with that as some background, allegations then emerged that Secretary Hegseth had issued a verbal directive that effectively amounted to, quote, kill everyone or, quote, leave no survivors, end quote. Now, a second strike was launched and no one survived. The White House and Secretary Hegseth have vehemently denied giving a specific kill order. Instead, they argue that the action was lawful, authorized by the operational commander, Admiral Frank Bradley. Now, on Thursday, Admiral Frank, or Mitch Bradley as he's known as, argued that it was clear that no such order was given, no order to kill them all. And that's according to Senator Tom Cotton, who was briefed in that committee. What some senators said was that was more problematic wasn't the order per se, but the video that they saw of the destroyed vessel. House Intelligence Committee ranking member Jim Himes, a Democrat, emerged from Admiral Bradley's briefing to tell reporters he was deeply disturbed by the footage. He would say this, "What I saw in that room was one of the most troubling things that I've seen in my time in public service. You have two individuals in clear distress, without any means of locomotion, with a destroyed vessel, who were killed by the United States," end quote. Inflaming this matter further, Hegseth has shared a doctored cover of a popular children's book series, Franklin the Turtle. Yeah, you heard me right, Franklin the Turtle. It features a new title, Franklin Targets Narco Terrorists, and in the picture, Franklin is wearing a military helmet and a tactical vest with an American flag patch as he leans out of a helicopter and shoots a rocket at a small boat in the water, which is exploding. The caption is, quote, "For your Christmas wish list," end quote. Okay. Not, I
the
would
follow-up
say,
is the Franklin the Tortoise Goes to the Hague, which I don't know if you've seen that meme out there, but
I've seen a lot of them, but I thought we'd save those, but this is just what happened, friends. I'm not,
Yeah.
So anyway, maybe I wouldn't call it the classiest of moves, but I think it does fit in with maybe President Trump's strategy to kind of own the libs. Now, later on Thursday, Turning Point USA spokesperson Andrew Colvelt wrote on X that, quote, "Every new attack aimed at Pete Hegseth makes me want another narco drug boat blown up and sent to the bottom of the ocean," end quote. That's not exactly, noteworthy. I mean, it's TPUSA. But Hegseth, of course, responds to that post with this, quote, "Your wish is our command, Andrew. Just sunk another narco boat," end quote. Now, let's get past the memes of the Secretary of Defense for a moment and X posts and talk a little bit about rules of engagement, or ROEs. And they're not just bureaucratic red tape. They are, in fact, legal and ethical frameworks which define the difference between professional military and just people who kill people, right? If there is, in fact, a distinction, that is where the distinction is going to be found. And so the Secretary of Defense is reportedly encouraging, even informally, the targeting of combatants or survivors. It places, everyone's in legal jeopardy. This isn't necessarily a surprise. I don't think that's an editorial, because Hegseth himself has forcefully argued that we, quote, "need a warrior culture," end quote. And he has attacked what he's called the rigid legal structures of the Department of Defense. Names matter. And I think, earlier when we started this, might say, is it the Department of War, the Department of Defense? That idea that we need to rename it is part of that strategy, right? Hegseth has previously pardoned or advocated for service members accused of war crimes. Now in command, it appears that he is operationalizing that philosophy. And there's a lot of political impact here, Justin. First, it strains relationships between uniformed military leaderships who are sworn to uphold the Constitution and international law and their civilian overseers. And second, it tests the international community's collective patience. These strikes occurred in international waters, and killing survivors of a shipwreck is a grave breach of maritime and international law. And this isn't just speculation. Hegseth has also recently asked the United States Southern Command head, Admiral Alvin Halsey, a 4-star Navy admiral, to step down just this week on Thursday after he voiced concerns around what he allegedly called the murky legality of the attacks, according to the Wall Street Journal. Relatedly, and also on Thursday, the Defense Department's Inspector General released a partially redacted report into Hegseth's use of the Signal messaging app in March to share sensitive information about a military strike against Yemen's Houthi militants. The report found that Hegseth had endangered service members by doing that on his personal phone, yet he didn't commit a crime, according to the report, because the very act of putting them onto Signal declassified them, and he has the authority to declassify material. And both of these things have been swirling. So, okay, let's start editorializing here for a second, Justin. Should Franklin start blowing up some, more narco boats? What do you think?
No, for gosh sakes. I think my mind is working in like 17 different directions here of outrage. This is not like just ways that this is bad. I think there are so many problems with this, and it typifies, I think, a larger problem with the administration, which I'll build to, I suppose. But thinking about this sort of in context, I mean, we have, to an extent, we've had this debate for a while about rules of engagement and the extent to which we should have limits. A lot of the discussion around this, the public facing of this, reminds me of the My Lai massacre in 1968, where there was now this is a little more direct, but that question of like, was there an order to kill everybody or not? Which was, so My Lai was basically a unit of American soldiers went wild on a small village in Vietnam, and really exceeded anything that would have been an order. I mean, they were, raping and killing children and things like that, on top of everything else. And there were no combatants there. But some of what it hinged on was, do you follow the order, and what was the order? And it was unclear what the order was, and things. And everybody, much like this, was ducking, saying, well, that's not what I said, or that's not the order I gave, et cetera.
I left the room before the operation.
The operation. But kind of William Calley, who was the only person who went down for this, who ended up being pardoned later by Nixon. A lot of people rallied behind him. That look, why should we? We want. They didn't use the word warrior culture, but it's the same strain. That look, if we're going to beat the communists, everything needs to be on the table. Sort of thing. And I have a large problem with that, I think all of this operation, before we even get to the double tap nature of this, which there are added details that I find even grosser. But nothing here. First of all, nothing here establishes, to my mind, that there is a meaningful drug traffic between Venezuela and the U.S. along these routes. You could island hop, I guess, but it's 1,000 miles. And these are not big boats. And frankly, the number of people that are on them don't make sense for running large quantities of drugs. Beyond that, even if they are, the punishment for running drugs is not death, and not death from above. So, I think the authority of doing all of this in the first place is highly suspect. We have a lot of success in the past with the Coast Guard doing interdiction of boats, doing things like you don't have to blow people up. Again, I'm not saying that we should be doing lots of drugs, but he's also pitching this as fentanyl, and approximately 0% of fentanyl comes from Venezuela. But it's not clear that really any of this is headed to the U.S. So, the justification for doing this in the first place. But kind of the second part of this, that I think is the part that really troubles people. I don't think the strikes are good in the first place, is my general sense. Like, this is not a sensible, it's suspicion of carrying drugs. Like, do we even know that there are drugs on this boat? Probably on some of them, but even if that's the case, is that the punishment? But the other part is apparently they watched these guys on the boat for 41 minutes before they decided to blow them up. And clearly they're not. That's, as you pointed out, this is the statutory example. This is the training example. There was actually a German commander in World War II executed at Nuremberg for killing survivors of a shipwreck. It's really clear cut that at a minimum, that part is problematic. Not just problematic, it's illegal and immoral. But the other part of this is that I don't think that the first part of this makes any sense either. I mean, I think and I've seen certainly conservatives point to, Obama and drone strikes and things, which I also don't support, I would add. But I'm not sure what authority these attacks have in the first place, let alone, kind of the follow-ups, especially when there are better options. But I think this goes back to, this is exactly Trump's attitude on policing as well, on the domestic side, that, we are just too good to potential criminals, people under arrest, and he had some quip about, and hit their head on the side of the car when you put them in, and things. And really to the rule of law in general, that, there should be essentially no restrictions on what the administration wants to do as far as punishing wrongdoing. And that is, I think, one of the things that just really drives me crazy is that one of the things that small r Republican government is supposed to be is a rule of law, as to have a rule of law. We have processes, we have protections, etc. And, we have these things that are built in that even people who are accused and convicted of doing bad things are entitled to certain processes and protections. And essentially, the MAGA take on this from top to bottom is that no, that's wimpy. That's undercutting our ability to get our interests across, et cetera. And we're seeing this with ICE raids and things like that too. I mean, is that we are setting aside these things that I think are fundamental to what we are supposed to be about.
Exactly.
And I think that is what is really troubling to me. But the people cheer these on. And, when I teach the 4th through 8th Amendments in my intro American class, one thing that I point out is that these are really unpopular with people. People get really mad about, why don't we just
stop the men guys?
Why don't we just execute child molesters, on the spot or things like that? I mean, that's where these always go. But
you're putting it into domestic policy perspective. I would add here that I think that the idea of there being treaties and international law have even less respect across the board. And so we have this kind of popular idea that international law treaties, they don't really matter, right? They, kind of wink, wink. Maybe only the weak people pay attention to those because they're trying to hold the strong people down, or they're not real, or whatever. But I would like to add here is, kind of a moral, we're doing in for our shows, ideological points of view. We're going to be taking on another ideology here for our bonus show, but let's be very thoughtful. One of the primary responses to anarchists, which we'll get to eventually, right? The idea is that what makes the state unique is that it will, in fact, follow certain kinds of rules and boundaries. If you think the state has no limit to what it can do, I mean, in some ways, you're kind of forcing individuals to say, well, you ought to be an anarchist because the state can just blow you up whenever it feels like it. Laws and rules don't apply to the state because it's a state.
To put this in the context of something we talked about before, Locke won out the argument, for American influence and not Hobbes.
Exactly.
Well, Hobbes was basically, government can do what it wants, to keep us out of the state of nature, and Locke was not. And, Locke is where we have the influence, not Hobbes.
And the very idea is that one of the most important elements is over our lives, over anybody's life. And so that's a big deal, right?
I'm going to go completely left field here, but
shoot,
for an example, if you've ever read the original Bram Stoker Dracula, like actually the book, one of the themes there is the degradation that happens to people hunting vampires as they try to stop evil. Which I keep coming back to. And I mean, admittedly, this is very, but basically, in trying to kill the vampire, they do all of these, they're desecrating graves and defiling corpses and all these other awful things. And it changes them for the worse. And to my mind, I think I keep going back to this for some reason, and nobody out there is going to think that this is anything other than completely dumb. But I do feel like that this is, I think, part of what bothers me about this is it's that same sentiment that it sort of degrades who we are and what's important about who we are and about having the moral upper hand.
But maybe we should move on a little bit here. and get to our third story, because I think there's some interaction with how it deals with thinking about the law. In this case, we're thinking international. We can also think domestically, because over in the legal world, there was kind of a significant blow theoretically dealt to President Trump's strategy of reshaping the Department of Justice.
Say hello to the all-new Alexa Plus and see how Alexa can do so much more for you. Need tickets to see your favorite artist? Craving your comfort restaurant? Just sit back, relax, and talk naturally. Alexa's on it. It learns your style, anticipates what's next, and makes it happen across Echo, Fire TV, and more. Learn more at amazon.com/new Alexa.
The Third Circuit Court of Appeals upheld a ruling disqualifying Alina Habba from serving as the United States Attorney for New Jersey. Now, what is going on? Now, Ken and I actually talked about this earlier in the year, and it deals with the Vacancies Reform Act, or as The Atlantic put it, I love this, quote, "The specifics of these legal disputes are dry and hyper-technical." And quote, and that's true. It is true.
That's a
but
great
it's also
Ken
important.
story.
It is a great. We don't have Ken today. We've got us.
Not that he's dry and hyper-technical, but hyper-technical he can get into better than I can.
I think he can. That's there. Now, Habba, she was not and is not a career prosecutor. Instead, she was President Donald Trump's personal attorney and 2024 campaign advisor. Now, on January 8th, the presidentially appointed and Senate-confirmed United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey, Philip Sellinger, he resigned. Now, following protocol, the first assistant U.S. attorney automatically takes over as acting United States Attorney for New Jersey. Then on March 3rd, Attorney General Bondi appoints Giordano as the interim for New Jersey. Now, he will then resign. Habab replaces him, and she's sworn in on March 28th. Now, the problem is that it was clear, even to the administration, that she wasn't going to survive a Senate confirmation hearing. And so they kind of attempt to maneuver her into that role through an acting capacity, bypassing the legislative branch entirely. The courts have the opportunity to say no, and that's what they've done. They've said no, and since the Senate never acted on the nomination, it expired after 120 days. And so what the Third Circuit Court is effectively saying is, you can't keep serving in this role. It's over as a result of this Vacancies Act. Again, it's a little more technical than that, but this is my non-technical version to explain this for listeners. Now, what we're essentially doing here, what the Third Circuit is saying, is you can't simply reshuffle personnel loyalists into high-ranking DOJ positions without adhering to federal law, which means you have to loop the courts in, or you have to get a Senate confirmation. It also begins to point out, and this is my area, a potential limit of unitary executive theory. So Trump's team is arguing that we don't need to do that. And as a matter of fact, what's interesting about that unitary executive theory, as of today, 3 days later now, Bob, she continues to claim that she is the top federal prosecutor. Her social media, the DOJ website, her public appearances still list her as acting U.S. attorney. And this creates a huge constitutional standoff. We have the judicial branch saying, you're not a prosecutor. And we have the executive branch saying, yes, she absolutely is a prosecutor. And there is the gist of a really hyper-technical story. And it's hyper-technical, but the political impact of this, Justin, really can't be overstated, because if the administration can simply ignore the federal court order regarding appointments, then that means it can completely bypass the Senate's power to advise and consent. It's nullified. It's done. That'll be dead. And it also potentially jeopardizes every single case that comes through New Jersey. As a matter of fact, as of this morning, there are already dozens of defense attorneys across the state filing motions to dismiss because the prosecutor charging their clients have no legal authority to so do, and thereby, in this case, maybe let a lot of people out of the process, assuming that they uphold the Third Circuit. So there's a lot of, I mean, it's a technical issue, but there's some huge policy implications. So Justin, what are your thoughts about this?
Don't forget, Marbury v. Madison comes out of the most boring HR conflict ever. And so yeah, some of these seemingly minor things actually have giant, implications for our constitutional order. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to disagree with, there, or anything to disagree with, really. This is, again, I think maybe where I would go is what's the court going to do with this? If this ends up in front of the Supreme Court. The other case that's working its way through now that has sort of unitary executive implications is Trump v. Slaughter with the FTC commissioner that he fired. The chatter that I'm hearing is that that'll probably be 6-3 in favor of Trump. Now, the implications of that, I mean, that's firing, which is a little different. I would have a feeling, Clarence Thomas is probably on board with Trump bypassing Senate confirmation for people, but I'm not sure that John Roberts and some of the others.
I'm going to be honest with you. If Clarence Thomas actually comes down and says that the Trump administration can bypass this. And I don't know if you have been long. I have defended Clarence Thomas's jurisprudence.
He's an Oklahoman by connection, so you're obligated.
And Ken and I have talked about that. But if he does that, I will lose any remaining shreds. Again, he's not going to care about this, and that's fair. But I will have to inch towards. I won't be quite on with Ken saying that they're all just ideological hacks, but I'll have to at least agree with him that Clarence Thomas is an ideological hack, and I will let him know that. I will tell Ken, look, you said this, and I disagreed.
I hope you have a bet going for this, but yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think the issues are a little different, but I mean, there is this longstanding. I mean, I think this is part of the Federalist Society mission is to really strip out, really put the presidency on steroids, and I think this is the end goal, on some level, is to strip out a lot of oversights. I mean, I think some of these this is where it gets complicated because, I mean, none of this is in the Constitution, per se, in terms of some of these, this office didn't exist, at the time of that, of course, as a thing. But as a principle, I mean, we have an appointment power, but that most things are, most important things are subject to confirmation. And I would certainly hope the court would stand by that. I mean, I think the Trump v. Slaughter, I think Trump was wrong, but I also think that there is a more cogent argument to be made for firing somebody, I suppose, than to just. I don't think it's a good argument, but it's a cogent argument. Whereas, like, hey, you can just appoint whoever you want, and yeah, indefinitely.
Well, and again, I want to point out this is not some kind of new modern theory. Ken and I, you and I are going through ideologies. Ken and I are going through the Federalist Papers, and so I thought I might bring Alexander Hamilton into play here. He argues in the Federal Papers that this process, in other words, having the Senate confirm, would tend greatly to preventing the appointment of unfit characters, end quote. And what he's saying is within the executive branch. And as a result, the president will be less likely to put forward candidates qualified only by his own, this is his word, not mine, favoritism. And so the whole idea is that given the prospect of embarrassment or unimpressment before the Senate, certain kinds of candidates, when you don't think they can make that process, you would never even put them forward at the outset of it.
Yeah.
And that's an important element, he argues, of the legislators' ability to rein in executive power. He's specifically responding to anti-federalists who were arguing that the president's power was far too undefined and ergo too great. And he's responding to this to say, no, actually, we have these really important legislative checks. And so the idea that this is somehow some kind of new or some kind of deep restraint on, bad restraint on the presidency. Well, friends, even if you're an originalist, I don't know how you get around this particular one, because here we are, Hamilton, who is in fact a founder who wanted a very strong, robust executive.
And has a musical.
My name is Alexander Hamilton. Sorry. But we can, the singing edition of the Politics
I'm not going to rap today. I'm sorry. That's I'm the one that is.
But no, it's a good point. But the point being, though, is if you were going to find a framer who might support an expanded unitary theory, hi Hamilton, and he's not agreeing with you,
Right?
And so my friends,
I don't know where you
find
amongst the framers where you'd find support for this sort of
nowhere.
thing.
The answer here's my scholarly, deeply informed position. I can turn you to nothing because there is none. And I defy anyone out there in the world to prove me wrong.
And this may be a less scholarly, but this situation and your Hamilton quote, which I think is apropos here, it reminds me a little bit of when George Bush tried to appoint Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court, who had been his personal attorney, it was.
But he took it to the Senate, and they laughed him away.
And it didn't even go to a vote, because it was, so, in your Hamiltonian sense, it wasn't enough to dissuade him in the first place, but certainly, they didn't even have to vote her down. Like, there was a recognition that, look, this is not somebody qualified. And I feel like, I have to say I don't know a whole lot about the career of Harriet Miers. But
I'm sure it's more distinguished than what we've seen here. From
you
the
beat me
basis of
to
what
it.
I know.
Yeah,
she was in fact a judge. She had done we're not talking about a person who has done precisely a grand total of nothing.
Yeah, Harriet Miers was a legitimate lawyer, just not somebody with
Yes.
Supreme Court kind of experience. Whereas, this person
She's not
is
laughable as.
she was like a civil litigator for a parking lot or something. Is like total
Yeah.
experience with a parking garage or something.
Yeah. They're not even on the same page of the book, but we'll continue forward. I think that we've harangued that enough, and I've left my message. We'll see what happens with this, and we'll see what happens with Ken and myself, and where I have to fall with Thomas. Now, let's turn. We got two more we're going to try to get to, Justin. But first, I think one that's probably a little bit faster. Let's talk a little bit and turn our attention to that the small special election in Tennessee. It's probably getting a little bit too much focus. Special elections are outliers. We talk about this in the show frequently.
You and I've talked. I feel like the last time they were around special elections, you and I were on. So yeah, it was.
It was that, right? We've got that. They're different, but it's hard. It's really hard to not want to focus on Tennessee's 7th congressional district and attempt to determine, is it the warning light, or not? So just briefly this week, Republican Matt Van Epps defeated Democrat Afton Ben to hold on to the seat vacated by Mark Green. Now, on the surface, a Republican winning a seat in Tennessee, why are we even talking about it, right? But when you look at the margins, right, this is a district that Mark Green won by over 20 points. It's deep red. It's MAGA country. Matt Van Epps, a candidate who ran strictly on that Make America Great Again platform, won only by 9 points. And so the question that's being bandied about is this a problem for MAGA, or is it just an outlier? Now, exit polling and on-the-ground reporting point to one massive voting cause, and that's cost of living. Now, despite the administration's promise of economic revival, voters in Tennessee, especially suburban voters, are reporting that they're feeling the pinch of inflation and healthcare costs. That's the empirics of what we're seeing in those exit polls. The Democrat, Ben, she ran a campaign hyper-focused on affordability and really tried to sidestep any culture wars talking points to just focusing on the checking accounts. So, but again, what are the real empirical takeaways from this? And I can't overstate this enough for our listeners, this non-representative one election sample. One, Dems continue to overperform in these unusual elections. So is this a shift potentially from Trump underperforming in the past? Trump did interject himself into the race clearly to help Van Epps. So this appears that Trump still has appeal, and it might look like it's still hard for Democrats to overcome him, even when they have kind of won over on the platform. And the third thing that's getting bandied about, of course, has been as a candidate is being questioned along with a lot of decisions about who Democratic candidate members are. In this case, he has so much social media and online videos that could be shared, including comments, which I saw about questioning whether the police should be dissolved in their entirety in Tennessee, that religion makes her uncomfortable, and then saying that both men and women can give birth. Now, whatever you think about,
she also said bad
views,
things about country music in Nashville.
Also a downside, but I wasn't going to bring that one up. But they're not even nearly mainstream views, and I think Democrats are asking themselves if in this era of where we ought to have some structural strengths, the fact that we're still losing suggests that we keep putting up kooks. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Democrat, so I want to be careful about calling them kooks, but that seems to be the language that Democrats are using. And, some, of course, predicted a Democrat victory. That didn't happen. Epps won. So what, if anything, do you think this means, Justin?
Not a lot.
Yeah.
I don't think there's
That's
a
fair.
lot to take away. And something I think I said last time, but that is always, especially around congressional races and doubly, especially around special elections, there is always this question, are there regularities that we can understand about elections, or are they each their own idiosyncratic little thing? And, I think congressional elections, I mean, it's some of both, but especially in a special election, idiosyncratic is certainly there. I mean, both parties are trying to spin this. To my mind, she performed about like you would expect, I think, given the other specials. And I think this is pause for Republicans. I think it needs to be, if they're paying attention, this is a wake up call. I think that, I mean, what is she, 13 points better, than Trump was there, give or take. That ain't nothing. And we've seen a lot around that margin. Where I see kind of on the left, people are trying to extrapolate, well, if he underperforms by 13 everywhere, and it's like, well, we can't assume that. And that's not going to be what happens. So,
and you have to be careful about that, because you're absolutely right. These kinds of elections have very weird, and by weird, I don't mean bad. I just mean unique, statistically speaking. You get unique turnout for them. And as a result of that unique turnout, you have to be, you can't generalize in the way that you do with other elections, because they are not the same representative people who are voting. And so you got to be careful about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a meaningful story here that, a double-digit underperformance for Republicans is, I think, a legitimate point of interest. This, if it were a 3-point underperformance, we wouldn't be talking about this at all. And so, I think, again, and this is, like I said, a month ago when we talked about, the other specials, the tradition is that the Republican Party is going to lose seats in the midterm. The incumbents party almost always does, with just a handful of exceptions. I've seen nothing about Trump that indicates that there's not going to be, a shift Democratic in these elections. I think the only things that are open is, what is the magnitude, which I'm kind of with you. I don't think we can, I don't think this gives us much leverage on that question, in terms of that. Also intersecting with these gerrymandering things, was it this morning or last night that
this morning, where the Supreme Court upheld
said
that
Texas can do its map. So, that is part of that story too. So,
and I'm sure that's something that the guys will cover next week.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just something we just didn't have time, on a Friday when we start recording at noon. You just can't.
I just came from class. Yeah. So
ditto.
but just to throw that in there, I mean, we don't even know what the map is going to be, and this is not. It's not fantastic data about like the magnitude of shift and so on and so forth. So, I mean, you could argue that, a 13-point shift, if anything, those Texas maps are going to be bad for Republicans at that point, because some of those districts are not safe enough, but I don't want to extrapolate a 13-point, change.
Well, we probably should move to our last story.
Yes, please.
For just a minute and move from there. And this one actually comes from my own backyard, the University of Oklahoma. A seemingly small dispute, as Reason Magazine puts it, over a single assignment's failing grade has become a national controversy. And the debate now includes Governor Stitt, Turning Points USA, and really the definition of academic freedom. Now, what happened is this. Samantha Falnecki is a pre-med junior. She received a 0 out of 25 points on a short essay in which she defended traditional gender roles and almost exclusively used the Bible as her evidence. Now, the assignment asked students to respond to a scientific study regarding gender norms and social popularity among middle schoolers. Falnecki, citing her religious beliefs, wrote an essay that didn't just disagree with the study, it went so far as to claim that a belief in multiple genders is, quote, demonic, end quote, and used the Bible as the evidence for that. Now, the instructor, a graduate student named Kurth, gave the paper a 0. The reasoning was largely academic. The paper failed to engage with the scientific material, lacked empirical evidence, right? As an aside in the comments, Kurth also notes that the language itself could be deemed offensive. Falnecki responded by arguing that the graduate student was discriminating against her on the basis of her religious faith. In the pre-social media era, I'm pretty sure that would have stayed between the student and the professor and gone through the normal grade appeal process if it ever made it there to start with, because 25 points in a gen ed class is probably not that much, although I haven't seen the syllabus, so I won't weigh in completely. But it would have been a dry academic conversation that maybe made it to a grade appeals committee. Now, this is not that era, it's 2025, so the student took her complaint first to Turning Point USA, which is the conservative advocacy group known, as you may know, for its professor watch list. Now, the TPUSA framed the narrative immediately. A Christian student is punished for quoting the Bible, and the story goes viral. Political pressure has mounted over the days. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt weighed in, calling for an investigation. The result? The university has placed the instructor on administrative leave, pending an outcome of the university's investigation. And in response, there has been now an online backlash against Falnecki's essay because it's become visible, arguing that it's poorly written, poorly argued, and is deserving of a 0, and that the university is just coddling conservatives. It is also complicated by the fact that the assignment itself was a low-stakes one, where it was just asked to include a, quote, thoughtful, end quote, reaction to the paper. It didn't seem to be asking for high-level academic responses. It also invited a bit of subjectiveness from students to just prove that they read the paper on bullying rates among middle schoolers based on their gender typicality, right? And so I think in a lot of ways, the story, Justin, is kind of a perfect microcosm of the current battle in higher education that we are dealing with all the time. On the one side, you've got the principles of some kinds of academic standards. And I say some kinds of academic standards because this has, I think, really been eroded both in and outside for a long time. What students come to us with and what we're allowed in some cases to demand that they can do has really come down. And so you get these, I saw this assignment. I thought, I've seen other professors do things like this, but part of the academic standards is the idea that in a science class, a psychology class, you got to use scientific evidence, and that you just a priori can't say because the Bible said so is not valid, is not a valid citation. And on the other side, you have this idea of a push for viewpoint diversity and for inclusion against the protection of religious expression, which argues that penalizing a student's worldview is a form of discrimination when you don't really are asking all of your students to have the same kind of scientific rigor. And that's probably fair on this kind of assignment. I don't think that was what was going on here. I think this was a did you read it or not assignment. But I still have, anyway, I'll get to what I think about that in a second. The political impact is also important. And it's because there's what OU is, or what University of Oklahoma has effectively done is it's argued, hey, I just feel bad as having been a graduate student. I'm just going to be honest up front. I mean, get your grade overturned, that kind of stuff. But to get placed on administrative leave is going to be the most scary thing in the history of mankind. And you never would have guessed it was coming. I can't even imagine how bad that feels. And now to have like TPUSA, STIT, or anybody, and all these, whether they're agreeing with you or disagreeing with you, to now to be at the center of all of this has to be awful. I don't think anybody's really said that. Over a 25-point assignment. And again, over an issue that should have been handled among the academics or the academics and students and administrators on a grade appeal panel. But here we are. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, I think quick version. I mean, the student is just wrong. Is the short version of this. I read it. It's terrible. I mean, it is, and not for religious reasons. And I will say, like, I have, depending on the assignment, I mean, I don't do anything anywhere near this controversial, in terms of topical stuff. But, I do use some of these sort of reflection or response assignments. And fundamentally, I in one of my classes this semester, I've got a couple of those. And, fundamentally, the goal of those is to engage with the material that you had. And this doesn't even begin to do that. Now, as a giant softie, I probably wouldn't have given no points, because, like, God, you have to really screw up to get that out of me. I think.
Well,
but
and if I had to critique something, I think this is a graduate student who was probably nervous they needed to give them a 0 because they hadn't engaged. But I think, I think somebody with
but
with a
fundamentally,
doctor in front of their name probably would have given them a few points.
yeah,
I'll be honest.
I would have given a few points probably, but I mean, it was poorly written. I mean, the mechanics were. I mean, it's just this person doesn't write well, but it doesn't do the assignment. Is the bottom line.
Well, and that would have been the bigger issue. Like when you're grading things, the answer is we were trying to see, did you read this? And the answer is from this assignment, no matter how poorly written it is, which is not the answer is I can't obtain whether you read this or not. And that would be my fundamental problem.
And it's certainly not to say that I haven't read the original article that they responded to, but I mean, you could make all kinds of critiques of that, and heck, you could probably make a biblical critique. I mean, I always struggle
even
with that.
A personal critique. You could have said, well, here was in fact here was their concluding evidence. But of course, as a person of faith, we come to it with a different position or whatever.
And beyond that, I mean, I'm a methodologist at heart, but I mean, every piece of research on trans anything that I've seen has horrible sample size problems. I mean, you could make an easy methodological.
Well, but again,
case.
you're assuming that this pre-med student,
this person has nowhere near that level of
sample size issues, and I'm going to be honest, I don't think this junior has any idea about that.
No, but what I was going to say, just to go back to this, I mean, to me, this whole thing feels like a setup on some level. I mean, her mom was a J6 attorney for people, on top of everything else.
I had not seen that when I was doing this.
She was. So to my mind, I mean, this feels like it was done on purpose to be provocative on some level. And, we've been having some discussions about this. I mean, and it makes it really frustrating to kind of engage with students in certain ways. But, we've all had that student. I had one a couple semesters ago who just, it was off topic stuff before class all the time that she was just always trying to get me to engage with. And I was pretty careful most of the time just not to, that's not what this class is about, but it really had this feeling like I'm being recorded and being set up for something. And this really has that feel to it. I mean, there is sort of this witch hunt on anything that is, gender ideology and what have you, at this point. And, I really feel like her purpose is to get this material kicked out of the university. Ultimately is the end goal. I mean, this isn't even about this essay.
And I'll go one further too. One of the things that bothered me about this, even on a personal level, is that it bothers me as a person, a Christian. It bothers me as a Christian because it continues the myth that all Christians are historically and must be some kind of evangelical and evangelical conservative to boot that goes together, and that's just simply not the case. And the idea that Christianity is somehow definitively even that Christianity speaks to the idea of what we mean in the scientific literature about gender. I will happily have a theological conversation with anybody who wants to raise that one. Well, let's come on the show. We can.
I'm not equipped for that, but yeah.
And that's fair, right? I'm not trying to get no. But like for the student, I would happily have that conversation with you and say, let's have a scriptural conversation. I'm going to deeply disagree, but the underlying assumption here is that I have to ipso facto be wrong because, right? Which is also problematic. And here's the other thing that I think that is frustrating for me. I talk to students about about this in my general education classes because I work at a Christian university, and I say, look, one of the things many parents, many people who come to a Christian university, what they assume that means is we're going to have some kind of blinders on. That means we're going to not study certain things, or we have to have a priori positions. And I blow that notion up for students in my gen ed classes and say, look, that is not at all what's going on. We are going to encounter things that are not consistent with your Christian faith, and we're going to study them and understand them. And if we can't study and understand things that are not part of our worldview, that we disagree with even empirically, then we're not really engaging in the academic process, right? So if I want to demonstrate that Marxism is wrong, and I do hold that Marxism is wrong, I want to defeat Marxism in the best version of it that exists. I want to understand. I don't want to create a straw man. I don't want to come up against. I don't want to assume that I can't do it. I don't want to assume that anybody who's doing it is automatically evil. I want to have the best version of Marxism that there is right there in front of me, and then still be able to provide evidence, positions, and against it. That's the academic process. And you're absolutely right. At base, this, and I didn't recognize the Jan 6 connection here, that kind of setup process is designed to stop us from that. And that's true learning.
And if I could add one other thing on kind of the purpose of academia, then we probably need to be done, but I think what I'm seeing in so many of the comments from people, frankly, in both directions, more so from the people defending her, is that people fundamentally do not understand what college and college writing is about. Like this is not, and I get students that ask this on assignments. It's like, can I include my opinions in this assignment? And, my general response is, I could give two shits about your opinions about this, that, and often say it that way, but and I think people, they extrapolate this to academic research as well. My gripe here is that, look, there is a process for all of these things, and there are purposes to these things, and there are standards to these things. And, we're not just sitting around, writing about, oh, this is what I think, about the world, or, trying to turn you.
Sorry, continue. I was agreeing with you. My apologies.
Oh yeah, fundamentally, so many things is like, well, it was an opinion paper. And it's like, well, no, fundamentally, it was not an opinion paper. That's not what, and, there are times that we assign opinion papers for things just like, hey, can you write about something, like if we're checking the mechanics or things. But, this is not that. It is, did you read and did you understand this? And can you say something about it? And, fundamentally fails there. But I've seen from so many people, describing this assignment, it was like, well, of course you did, because it's just your opinion. And, the whole idea that, well, that's all college is. That I think fundamentally is what gets under my skin, about this whole situation, is that there's just so little understanding and respect for the process of what we do. And
on the other hand, to give it, the other attack, oh, it's poorly written. And it's like, well, my guess is that every single one of these responses was poorly written, because when you're writing about things you don't know about, you're not going to write well off the bat.
Bad college writing is just to be expected. I think actually the standard for this would be,
did you read, and is it clear that you understood the central purposes of what you read?
Right. And I think actually, what might figure in here, where I could be persuaded that the student was treated slightly unfairly is, what score might happen to somebody that did something similar in a different direction
without the Bible.
Because I could be persuaded that, like I said, I would have given some points. I wouldn't have given.
I can easily imagine that once you did the normal appeals process, and I don't know the University of Oklahoma's off the top of my head, but my guess is it's something similar to every other institution I've been at. My guess is it goes to the chair first, goes to the dean, and then it goes to your appeals board, right?
That's typical.
I can easily imagine a chair stepping in, having a conversation with this instructor, i.e. a graduate student, and going, hey, you're new at this. Let me help you out here. This was not a 0. Was this what was supposed to happen? No. But should it have been a 0? No. Maybe like she turned something in. It's a 15. Yeah. And that will solve this problem. And then boom, we move on. Unless, of course, your hypothesis is right about that stuff I didn't know.
I don't think this would have solved the problem, to be honest.
Which wouldn't have, right? But I think in a normal circumstance, and that's why you have those processes, right? That's why you have especially for graduate students who are learning, right? Like, this is probably the first time this individual has taught, right? I have a lot of sympathy on that front. That's all.
I do. Grading's miserable. Yeah. So,
well, friends, on that note, we end not only the podcast but the semester because this is our last week of classes. So we will though be doing a midweek show, and I am excited about that because we're getting to socialism and our ideologies. So Justin and I have been doing a series on political ideologies. Ken and I are going through the Federalist Papers. We're just doing all kind of really cool things. And so I'd love for you to be a part of that. But to do that, you've got to become a supporter of the show. It's only going to take you about 15 minutes or so. So just go ahead, head to politicsguys.com/support, or just head down to the show notes where you can see all the different ways you can support the show. You can also get us at patreon.com/politicsguys. Don't forget, you can always email us at mail@politicsguys.com. It's also really important that you rate, subscribe, and review. I know I've been telling my students this, the ratings matter. The ratings matter. Review the class, review the show. So I'd really appreciate if you did that. That really improves and helps on algorithms. And so does actually sharing episodes on social media. And so with that, I want to give a special thank you, as always, to the executive producers of the Politics Guys. And they are Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Miller. We'll be back with our special episode on Tuesday.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,